Thank you, Catherine, for this wonderful opportunity to talk a little about my family on my mother's side under the title of Family Drawn into War. And this is a talk that I gave to PAVE participants on Tuesday, the 21st of February, 2023. And my name is Mark England, and I've known you, Catherine, for many years now. Of course, you're a practicing psychologist, as well as a solicitor with great knowledge
Barrister,
in the
actually.
area. Sorry, Catherine.
Barrister, yeah.
Barrister, not a barrister, of course. We have that distinction in Australia. And with great knowledge of dispute resolution, and you've worked overseas, etc. And of course, together through the Sydney branch of the Australian Psychological Society, with me as the chair of that branch, covering 4,500 psychologists across the Sydney branch, the largest branch in Australia. You were also on the committee, and together we established, amongst other things, a dispute resolution interest group for psychologists to join and learn about and practice dispute resolution, which they did in states throughout Australia. So we have a strong background together, and of course your PAVE initiative is an opportunity for me to talk about the wonderful work of Edgar Towner and other members of my family. So I will say a little more than I said in the PAVE presentation, as often happens with actual recordings, but not too much more. So my great uncle, Edgar Thomas Towner, MCVC, was very active throughout World War I. World War I, as we know, was effectively a dispute on a global scale, which was resolved through a war considered at the time a war to end all wars. It, of course, continued and finally ran its course through to the end of World War II, while a relatively calm interim has been maintained. We seem now to be again entering dangerous times on a global scale. And of course, the Herald, for example, is full of, imminent war within 3 years between China and Australia, and America's poor diplomacy, etc. So we live in, once again, dangerous times. Edgar was born in April 1890, and he passed away in August 1972, the 18th of August 1972. So he lived a long life. He was my grandmother's half-brother, and he was very fond of both my grandmother and my mother. Now, I never met Edgar, but through the conversations I've had with other members of the family, I can talk to you about him, and I'd like to bring out his personality a little. Both he and my grandmother were born in Blackall, which is in Queensland. It's a little town in Queensland. They were pastoralists, and my mother talked to me about the time Edgar visited her family, and they were living in Dubbo at the time. He was well off. This is my mother speaking. He was well off, and his family had big properties in Western Queensland. He stayed in the middle of the Depression in Dubbo for a week and ate very well. Mum, grandma, said of Edgar, that's my grandmother, said of Edgar, you would think he would leave something on the bottom of the plate. And she was a very direct speaker. He had a very good time in Dubbo during that week. He was a big man who was pleasant enough. He came for dinner, but did not stay in the Dubbo house. And he went out on the town with my aunt, and she remembers him as having a good time. In Army dispatches, he was cited for his cheerful and untiring attitude and for setting a conspicuous example. So he was always cheerful and always helpful to other members of the team and others who he came across, and for these reasons he was considered a good leader. In addition to being a grazier, Edgar was a career soldier. He joined the Army Reserves early in his life, and when World War I began, he responded to the request of the British Empire, and in 1915 joined the Australian Imperial Forces. His sister Greta soon afterwards enlisted as a nurse. Edgar began in the transport section of the 25th Battalion, and his tasks included cleaning up the stables. And he said when food was called, it was a rush, and like pigs to a trough, unless you moved quickly, you could miss out. So he was pretty hungry a lot of the time, and they were pretty tough circumstances that he was in. Many of those who enlisted were from the country, and being good with horses, it was with horses in the transport section that Edgar was posted. We could see from his wartime diaries that life was tough then. He was transported to Egypt, and while serving in Egypt, Edgar transferred to the 2nd Machine Gun Battalion and quickly showed his mettle as being a leader, strong and able to shoot accurately. Soon sent to the Western Front, the machine gun battalions were relatively new in the army, and so it was a line of quick progression for Edgar. He was soon commissioned as a lieutenant and twice mentioned in dispatches for his leadership. During June 1918, Edgar led a machine gun section in attack near Molencourt and assisted the infantry in reaching its objectives under heavy fire, for which he was awarded the Military Cross. And then on 1st of September 1918, again commanding a machine gun section, he was involved in the Allied counter-offensive that broke the German lines at Mons-Saint-Quentin and Péronne. So this was a critical part of the war. The Germans, it was the last offensive by the Germans, and it's the famous Hindenburg Line that was broken in this offensive. And that really called an end to World War I. So fighting for 30 hours after being wounded, his conspicuous bravery, initiative and devotion to duty earned him the Victoria Cross, which was presented by King George V in April 1919. He was known as the Giant Anzac, being bigger in stature than the others who received the VC during World War I. Interestingly, Edgar's brothers were all taller than him, with his father reportedly being 6'7" tall, and John Towner, his nephew, who I've met, is 6'4". He's a very big man as well. Keith Murdoch, Australia's official war historian, was present in France during the Australian offensive, as was the then Prime Minister Billy Hughes. Both were opposed to the Australian military leaders behind this battle. That's the Battle of Mons-Saint-Quentin. Monash and Rosenthal, these were the leaders that they were opposed to because these leaders were Jewish. As a consequence, the decisive battle for Mons-Saint-Quentin was never given the attention it deserved. Bill Billett, a military historian who served with the Royal Marines and the SAS, cites in his book Mons-Saint-Quentin, A Soldier's Battle, cited that Mons-Saint-Quentin earned high praise in 1918, regarded by many as the highest achievement of the AIOF during the First World War. Now that's a huge statement. As Mr. Billett stated, at Mons-Saint-Quentin, Lieutenant Edgar Towner observed the enemy massing for a counter-attack. He and his men moved up 2 Vickers guns, each weighing 33 kilograms with tripod ammunition, plus a German machine gun Towner had captured single-handed earlier in the battle. With these guns, the section inflicted severe losses on the enemy. Later, when the German advance was resumed, his guns were running short of ammunition. In full view of the enemy, he seized another German machine gun and provided such effective fire that he forced the enemy to retreat. Sometime later, he again displayed more of his tremendous courage and lack of concern for his own safety when the 21st Battalion attacked a crater on the summit of the mount. The crater was full of German machine guns. Towner provided such effective enfilade fire, and that's fire from the side, that the enemy died, ran, or surrendered. And in fact, he's noted for having captured some 35 German soldiers. So he captured rather than killed. I attended a Spirit of Remembrance Centennial tour held in recognition of the battles Australia fought in France. And during the tour, I stood in the trench Edgar Towner fought from and witnessed the flat and exposed terrain he ran across. And to this day, I wonder how it was that the opposing Germans did not shoot him dead. As Towner, as John Towner, that's the cousin who knew Edgar and attended the tour, expressed, Edgar was either very mad or very brave in his view, and few in battle had suffered the duration of intense continuous warfare that Edgar did in the Battle of Mont-Saint-Quentin. Of those awarded Victoria Crosses in Australia, and I've been through all of their records of the 100 VCs, 100 Australians who've been awarded VCs, and only Sir Arthur Roden Cutler came close with commensurate traumatic long-term physical consequences. So it was a massive endurance of extreme conflict that he survived and continued fighting in. When World War II broke out, Edgar re-enlisted. After a period as a company commander, he was promoted to temporary major and second in command of the battalion under fellow Victoria Cross recipient Lieutenant Colonel Harry Murray. However, Towner retired from the army due to ill health on the 21st of February 1942 and returned to his property at Kalula. And a friend of mine who I know locally reports that his father, who was involved in the army there in Queensland, everyone had very high regard for Edgar at the time. The mental impact of the war on Edgar was indeed great. And this is what happens to so many returned soldiers, as we know. He suffered from such depression after World War I that he was treated by what at the time was cutting-edge medicine. Edgar's medical records show that he was administered electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, on a number of occasions to stem his depression. The shocks that he received were very high in terms of voltage, even for those early days of ECT. And in more modern times, the shocks administered are much less. So it's still administered, but nothing like it was then. When the impact of those shocks was such that he broke his own teeth from biting down hard while he was receiving the shocks. These broken teeth led to rotten gums, and Edgar wrote letters to Veteran Affairs requesting funding for the dentistry necessary to repair his teeth and gums. And his letters are written from his property under flood in Victoria, and his niece, a nurse, also wrote on his behalf expressing that the injury was an indirect result of his service and that he was on a remote station surrounded by floodwaters at the time. Veteran Affairs denied these payments, and so his teeth went untreated. I discovered this information by calling for his medical records as a relative. It is not widely known information, nor do we really know the extent of such treatment to other ex-servicemen and women. Another cutting-edge therapy at the time was lobotomy or leucotomy. It comprised tapping on a pick which was placed up the patient's nose. The outcome is that the connections to and from the brain's prefrontal cortex are severed. Such patients have become stuporous, confused, and incontinent. Their personality and intellect suffered. Some patients died as a result of the operation, and others have suicided. In summary, it typically left people with an infantile personality. Lobotomy is today a disparaged procedure. Edgar survived the lobotomy to live a quieter life while on his station. He would often disappear on trips around the countryside, having a great love of nature. Fascinated with the exploratory work of Sir Thomas Mitchell, who discovered the Barcoo River, Edgar carefully surveyed the earlier explorations of Sir Thomas Mitchell. He addressed the Royal Geographical Society of Australasia in Brisbane in 1955 and was awarded the Dr. Thomson Foundation Gold Medal for his geographical work. And the following year, Edgar's address was published in 1957 in a book entitled Lake Eyre and Its Tributaries. I arranged for that publication to be made available online through the Queensland State Library. Edgar was a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society and member of the Historic Society. There were both historical and geographical links of interest between Edgar and his brother-in-law, my grandfather's descendants, Robert Delhunty, Commissioner for Crown Lands and a magistrate in New South Wales, owned Dubbo Station, amongst a number of other stations. This and other stations he owned were managed by John Gillis, formerly a crofter in Queensland, and John Gillis was my great-grandfather and the father-in-law of Anne Eliza Gurley Towner, my grandmother. Robert Delhunty was both helpful towards and influenced by Sir Thomas Mitchell, and as such enhanced the bond Edgar Towner felt towards my maternal grandmother and grandfather. So there were close connections and close respect in the family. By the time of his death in 1972, he had amassed an 80,000 acre or 320 kilometre farm containing 25,000 sheep. He remains the highest decorated serviceman from Queensland. Now that achievement of amassing the station came from virtually nothing, because when he came back from the war, the station, the property he owned, the stock on it had been sold off by his brothers unbeknownst to him, and he went out as a station hand, started to build up his funds, and really went on from there. He remains the highest decorated serviceman from Queensland. On the 24th of April 2009, a statue of Towner, crafted by Melbourne sculptor William Eklutz, was unveiled in his birth town of Blackall. Inspired by an essay written by a local school, by the community raised $80,000 to commission a monument in Edgar Towner's memory. It's called Towner's Call, and the statue of Edgar Towner is in Blackall, Queensland. Now, a lot of that money was, in fact, donated by John Towner, who went on to become very wealthy as somewhat of an oil baron, applying agricultural techniques to generating oil and gas from old wells. The Hall of Valour, the Australian War Memorial, features the uniform of Edgar Towner on a dummy statue. You can see his uniform there. Also at the memorial is reference to Edgar's nephew, Bertie Foxley. And Bertie was a dam buster. Bertie was nicknamed Toby in honour of his uncle Edgar Towner, whom he greatly admired. The term Valhalla, if we reflect on, is Norse, referring to that place where great warriors reside in a type of glorious heaven. And here was the Hall of Valour, the Victorian War Memorial. So in Australia, our war heroes are revered, and both Edgar and Bertie fall into that category of Australian legends. So Bertie Towner lived from March 1920 to March 1985, a good life. And Flight Lieutenant Bertie Toby Towner Foxley was an air gunner. He flew 50 sorties with the dam busters, which is an awful lot, still survived. And they're renowned for being shot out of the air. It was a very dangerous operation. The last mission was against the Anthor Viaduct in southern France on the 12th of February 1944. It ended badly for the crew, with Bob Hay being mortally wounded and the aircraft only just making it to Sardinia. He worked as an air traffic controller with the RAF for 15 years in England and Germany. He then briefly farmed in the UK, then ran service stations in Brisbane, followed by a successful ownership of the commercial hotel motel in Chinchilla, Queensland. He retired in 1977 and settled in Keyworth, Nottinghamshire. Also notable in the Towner family is Edgar's sister, Greta Towner. Greta served Australia by working as a nurse during the Great War, and she lived from 1891 to 1961. Greta Towner trained in nursing at Rockhampton Children's Hospital, registering as a nurse in August 1914 and enlisting in the Australian Army Nursing Service in July 1915. Sister Towner served with the AANS, or the Australian Army Nursing Service, in Egypt, at Heliopolis, Cairo, Lemnos Island, and from September 1915 during the Gallipoli campaign, and on sea transport ships. In 1917, she saw service in England at the Southall Hospital, which specialised in amputations and artificial limbs. In March 1917, she arrived in France and was posted to the 8th Stationary Hospital in Rouen. On the 27th of September 1917, she was posted to the 1 AGH, or First Australian General Hospital in Rouen, and served there for the remainder of the First World War. Sister Towner was officially discharged 4 July 1919. Greta was interviewed by the media and the report was as follows. The conditions on Gallipoli had been diseases such as dysentery, various fevers, rheumatics, gastritis and pneumonia became endemic. The sick and injured were transported to ships and islands, including Lemnos Island, where just months before the Anzacs had practiced their landings before the landing on Gallipoli on April 25th, 1915. Greta and her fellow nurses at 2ASH worked in primitive conditions, caring for sick patients in tents without running water, sewerage systems, and indeed often with a lack of proper medical supplies to care for the men. The commanding officers did not warmly welcome Greta and her fellow nurses. It was the first time women had served in the 2ASH. The Western, and that's really significant, here it is, International Women's Day, and we're celebrating Greta's great success. The Western Champion and General Advertiser for the Central Western District, Sparkledome, Queensland, 1892 to 1922, 26 July 1919. Page 14 is where that quote came from. Greta was awarded the 1914 to 1915 Star, the British War Medal and the Victory Medal for her war service. And really, she was one of the first to be recognised by the Army and became a lieutenant. After studying pharmacy for 12 months at the University of Sydney, Greta moved to the United States, where she spent her life nursing veterans. Her second marriage there was to Harry Maloney, who worked at Stanford University. On November 2023, a statue in Greta's honour is to be erected in the same park in Blackall as the statue of her brother Edgar Towner. The Sunday Times, the 29th June 1919, reported, Greta Towner is an Anzac nurse, comes from a family of distinguished soldiers and has herself an honourable military record. She was one of the nurses on duty at Lemnos during the Gallipoli campaign and was mentioned in dispatches. The Imperial government then lent Sister Towner to the French, and she saw service in the French military hospitals until signing of the armistice. Sister Towner, so she was involved in the battlefield right through. Sister Towner has since been doing transport duty for the Australian Imperial Forces. She is sister of Lieutenant Towner VCMC, the big Queenslander, who is known in London as the Giant Anzac. Lieutenant Commander Harold Orton, VC DSC of HMS Stockforce, and known as the Mystery VC, is a cousin. He has lately published an interesting book entitled Q-Boat Adventures. Lieutenant Colonel Hudson, VC DSO of the Sherwood Forestry VIF 13A, is a brother-in-law. The following is some mention of Commander Orton and Lieutenant Colonel Hudson. So Commander Harold Orton, VC, was awarded the Victoria Cross in 1918 following an action where he was commanding a Q ship, HMAS Stockforce. Harold Orton wrote Q-Boat Adventures, the first book on Q ships, in 1919. After the war, he became an executive vice president in the Rank organization in New York and lived for 30 years in Bosquill, Pennsylvania, where he owned a hotel and cinema. However, he remained a member of the RNR and in 1941 was awarded the Royal Naval Reserve Officers decoration. During World War II, he held the rank of commander, later acting captain in the RNR, and served as senior and organising transatlantic convoys. He was made an officer of the United States Legion of Merit to distinguished service in the Allied cause throughout the war, and a commander of the Order of Orange Nassau for service to the Royal Netherlands Navy during the war. Now, a little about Lieutenant Colonel Hudson VC, who at one stage was a general in the Army, and then due to conflict with the person above him, he was demoted back to his former position. And, but this, he was Greta and Edgar's brother-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel Hudson. So this family research has been inspired by my mother talking to me about the visits she experienced as a child from both Edgar Towner and his sister Greta. The key visit from Edgar was when he was taking tree seedlings from his property in Queensland through to Canberra. The trees were to commemorate soldiers from World War I and were in a van being hauled by his car. This activity depicts the love of Edgar that Edgar had for nature and the outback. Greta would visit from time to time from the United States and stay with them in Dubbo. My mother remembers Greta as a refined woman who was a joy to be with. She came bearing gifts from America, which were a delight to her. Both Edgar and Greta, along with so many others of my relatives, were drawn into the war, drawn into conflicts on an international scale that they fought valiantly to overcome with the hope of achieving peace. And really, my mother and her family in Dubbo were cut off from the Towners in Queensland because of the distance, and Mum wasn't a traveller. So I never really knew about or knew the Towners until towards the end of her life when she began talking about them and I researched them. So there we have it. That's the story that I'd like to convey to you. And thank you, Catherine, for this opportunity to do so.
And thank you, Mark, for an amazing story. I mean, what can I say with a heritage like that? I'm not surprised that you led the APS at the time of 4,000 psychologists. And it was at a time also when we realised the importance of lobbying ministers, and we managed to get the Medicare for psychologists during that period, and there was quite a fair bit that was happening, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to move the mediation world in a very similar vein to the way that the psychology world has progressed professionally. So I'm very happy that this is going to be one of the first recordings that we're going to place up on the PAVE website. There will be a new PAVE website that's going to be linked with the Mediation Quest website at this stage, and I will be sending a copy of this off to our IT guys later this afternoon. So many thanks, Mark, and do enjoy the rest of your journeys, especially going to a wedding in Greece, which
yes, that's right.
We'll look forward to hearing the stories of that.
Remind me of your heritage, Catherine.
That'll
But I wonder, could you send me a link for those websites so that I can see?
Yes, I will. And in fact, I'll see when I receive a link to this recording, I'll send you a link to this as well. Okay.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for all the work you've done, Mark. I really do appreciate it. And I know that when Ashley heard the first time, he was just mesmerised. And it's some of the people that missed that talk will now be looking forward to going back and being able to hear it now that it's been recorded. So many thanks for that.
Thank you. Wonderful. And hi to Ashley. We had a great chat before the actual.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very, very much.
Bye.
I'll just end of recording.